Well, good morning. It's good to be together. I'm very excited to introduce our first speakers. Just want to go over our agenda today. Our first part, we're going to be talking about prevention and community resources. So thankful to have our therapists, Lindsey and Emmy, here. As most of you know, I'm Jaime Polson, pastor for care ministry and executive ministry at the church. And I do have a Master of Social Work degree, but I'm not licensed. So I always like to make sure we have licensed people when we're talking about something like suicide prevention and also working with those who've been affected by suicide, really important. And also the information changes continually. So I try to stay well read, but statistics and groups affected, that changes on a very regular basis. We've seen a real decline in girls' and women's health in particular in the past few years coming out of the pandemic. So we'll talk about that a little bit more today. But that's why it's really important, I think, that we did a great 2-day series on suicide prevention. I know many of you were here last year at the church, but it's really important for us to continue to learn and grow on prevention. So that's why we're doing both prevention and postvention, meaning how do we then work with people who are affected by suicide. And I will be talking the second part of our class and training really about how to walk alongside people as Stephen ministry, which many of you are Stephen ministers. I know we also have parents. And a lot of our parents who have teenagers wanted to be here today. They cannot. So thankful we're recording this. And I promised our youth group we would send it out to them later in the day so that parents who would have liked to be here, they could be here too with us. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and open us in prayer, and then I'm going to invite our speakers to come, and I'll do a little introduction. So let's pray. God, we thank you that you have given us so many resources, and you call us to be stewards of people's mental health, their physical health, and their overall well-being, including their spiritual health. Teach us today and guide us. We give you thanks for professionals in our community who can be here to give us their wisdom and how we can make sure we're supporting within our church and also our fuller community, which you call us to serve each and every day. Thank you for this group on Zoom and in person who are here and dedicate their lives to serving other people, especially our families in this community. Amen. So today I'm very happy to introduce you to two wonderful professionals. They'll come up one at a time, but Lindsey Antin and Emmy Spencer, and they are both therapists in Lafayette. Many of our families go to their counseling center from LOPC and in the wider community. And so I've been really thankful for your work amidst our community. And again, they're going to be focusing on the prevention side for us today. I'll let them share a little bit. They both have incredible professional experience, and I'll let them share a little bit about the work that they do every day. But one of the big pieces, the important pieces, having them specifically come and talk is evidence-based research from University of Washington, Cornell, University of Chicago. Many places show that the kind of therapy that they do at their practice, a solution-focused perspective, cognitive behavioral training, that really is important when you're working with people for suicide prevention as well as postvention. So hence why they're here with us today as our experts to teach us. So without further ado, welcome to Lindsey and Emmy. Thank you.
We are from Loyal Blue, a local practice. We have offices in Lafayette and in Berkeley near Rockridge BART. I'm actually a very local person. I grew up in Lafayette in Burton Valley. And I think the last time I was at LOPC was for my high school baccalaureate ceremony, which is so lovely. I don't know if you still do that here, but it's great to be back and maybe see some familiar faces later. So yeah, we're going to be talking about suicide prevention, and I'm going to let Emmy introduce our agenda and herself.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Emmy. I wanted to just say hi to the Zoom folks. I'm Emmy, and oh yeah, that's right, the clicker. Okay, beautiful.
It's like the arrows are not working. But.
Okay. I wanted to just share a little bit about kind of what brought me into mental health, and then also kind of why this topic is so important and dear to my heart. So before I became a therapist, I worked as a teacher for a little under a decade. And I saw a lot of kids and teens that were struggling in lots of different ways and maybe weren't getting the resources and the access to care that they needed. Maybe they didn't have a community like this to kind of help lift and support them up. And so I did lose a student to suicide. And so that has been just a really difficult thing to go through as a professional, but also someone who cared deeply about that person. So I just really wanted to share my gratitude for the topics that you all are learning about today. And just really, I want to root for you all kind of being support people for our community. And I want to tell you about our agenda. So we're going to start with a little bit of information about kind of the big factors and the details that can contribute to suicide risk in the community. We're going to share some statistics, things to look out for, and we're going to identify the why behind suicide, why folks consider suicide or think about suicide, and also some of the misconceptions that are really common in our culture, in our communities. We want to look at those and sort of debunk some of those today too. And the second thing we're going to look at is the more action-oriented piece, ways that we can really prevent and help intervene to stop folks when they might be heading toward that type of crisis. And we're going to look at ways to first check their safety, and then we're going to look at things that we can do within that kind of safety check, the emergency level, but also other levels, right? Not every person that's considering suicide is really in an emergency situation. And then we're going to look really excitedly, I'm excited about the last part because we're going to look at community prevention, things that, we can all kind of do together to help folks feel more held to get through these difficult times.
Can I have you scoot just a little closer?
To Lindsey, right here? Yes, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Lindsey to get us started with part one.
Yeah. This is a difficult topic, so I just wanted to say, even though we're trained therapists, I noticed when we were practicing earlier this week that I occasionally would just have to take a deep breath. We're not meant to talk about this topic lightly. It's not a breezy one, so that's also my way of saying give some grace for if I stumble over my words here. Okay. So just briefly to go over some suicide statistics, they are changing, like Jaime mentioned, but it is still the 11th leading cause of death. It actually decreased the first 2 decades of the century, it increased the first 2 decades of the century and decreased during the pandemic, which was interesting at first. And there's a lot of theories about why this might have happened, but the general idea of people checking up on one another and coming together in crisis seems to suggest that might have been true. It's specifically increasing now in certain populations, so people of color, especially Alaskan Natives, Native Americans, Black and Hispanic populations. And it's much more prevalent in men than in women, about 4 times as much. The age group of people who are successful in committing suicide are the elderly, our seniors who are above age 75, and especially those above 85. So that is something to keep in mind when we're talking about suicide. It is still very rare, and our next most populous age group is those in their mid-20s to mid-30s. The other statistic that's really important to emphasize is firearms. They are the most popular and the most lethal. So it's worth thinking about, even though it's difficult, how people do commit suicide. There are several different ways, but when it happens to be with a firearm, it is the most lethal. It's almost always the most successful. So what we're talking about now is risk factors for suicide. So because it's rare, I think it's important to also understand that it's kind of layered like a sandwich. There's not necessarily like one particular thing that is going to lead somebody to attempt suicide, and rather there's several different factors, and not just these factors that are here on this slide, but what that particular factor means to that person. So, for example, a previous suicide attempt is the highest risk factor. Might seem kind of obvious, but it's worth stating. We want to know that if somebody has attempted in the past. Having a mental health disorder, we're going to dive into that in our next section. chronic pain or illness. But again, it's what that chronic pain or illness actually means to that individual. If they are, having good health care around it, having good support, then they're less likely to attempt suicide. History of substance use, financial instability or lack of education, those are other factors that will increase one's risk of suicide, just according to the statistics. When life is harder. Some more social and kind of, I would say, like, of the moment things you want to think about when somebody might be at risk for suicide are recent loss of a family or friend. So if you can picture somebody who is going through a difficult loss of a partner, that would be someone that we would at least layer on one of those risk factors. Ongoing exposure to bullying behavior. This is not just with young people, but it's predominantly young people. Anyone who's experiencing that, especially without any relief. Anyone who's having relationship problems. You picture somebody having a big argument with somebody, being very dysregulated after that argument. That's a common risk factor. Living in a rural area, which seemed unusual to me when I was first thinking about that. And I thought, it's actually about access to healthcare and isolation. So it's not, again, not everybody lives in a rural area. My dad lives in Tahoe. It's very nice up there, but it's not always going to be a risk factor, but it's what that means to that person's mental health. And then last, access to harmful means. This is incredibly important. Someone might be in a moment feeling like they are thinking about suicide, and if they do not have access to lethal means, they are likely to get through that moment and survive. So Emmy's going to talk in a minute about the 4 pillars of suicide, and this is kind of a visual for those of us who like pictures, like I do. But I think that this diagram sort of illustrates the 3 different areas that we will talk about next, which is the capability for suicide. Do they have access to lethal means? Perceived burdensomeness. This is such a big one, especially in our senior community. And thwarted belongingness. You can picture this one of somebody who is feeling that social isolation, feeling left out. When these things all come together, it increases risk for suicide.
Okay, so we're going to take a moment to look a little more closely at some of these risk factors. And the first one that we're going to look at is mental health disorders. When folks are struggling or experiencing the symptoms of a mental health disorder, they can be at an 8-fold risk for considering or acting on suicidal thoughts. And particularly want to highlight things like trauma and personality disorders can be a big risk. And then really kind of important to emphasize major depressive disorder. And what often happens with major depressive disorder is that when folks are experiencing their first episode, right, they're having these really intense feelings of depression for the first time, that is an increased risk for suicide. And it's likely because of some of the things that Lindsey was talking about, right? Feeling overwhelmed by how big this challenge is, feeling kind of unfamiliar with these types of symptoms, and then lacking some of the social cohesion or some of the other resources that make it easier to manage. So we've listed the symptoms here, and we wanted to share them because it can be helpful to look out for these things in folks, right? So frequent depressed or hopeless mood, or especially a loss of interest or pleasure in things that the person used to enjoy. If you notice, really extreme weight loss or weight gain, if somebody is reporting that they can't sleep at all or they're sleeping a lot, and then similarly, if someone's really, restless, agitated, sort of jittery, moving around a lot, or if they're very slowed down. If the speech is slowed down, movement is slowed down, these are both kind of symptoms of major depressive disorder. Fatigue. In therapy, the main thing that we focus on and work on that can be really helpful is identifying these feelings of worthlessness and guilt and trying to address those. And lack of concentration. So of course, don't expect you to go out and diagnose folks and say, maybe you have major depressive disorder, but still a good thing to look for, right? And see if you see somebody that's having some of these symptoms, that's a person who you might want to pay a little extra attention to. Similarly, we want to highlight the risk factors within the LGBTQIA+ community. In our culture in this country, these folks, unfortunately, are experiencing a much higher increased risk of suicide. And so I want to share with you a couple of the statistics here. So suicide risk is 3 to 6 times greater in LGBT adults than heterosexual adults. Particularly transgender adults, prevalence of suicide attempts is 18 times higher than the general population. Just an astounding statistic. Nearly half of LGBTQ+ youth considered suicide in 2021. So we're talking about half of our youth that identify. And then 1 in 5 transgender and non-binary youth attempted suicide in the past year. I also just want to highlight that the rates of suicide attempts are highest among folks that are in the LGBTQ+ youth of color. So we think about the intersectionality of race and gender and race and sexuality. And in these cases, sometimes it can increase suicide risk. And lastly, most importantly, I just want to emphasize that, none of these kind of risks are indicating something inherent about gender identity or sexuality is related to suicide risk. It's in fact that these folks are placed at a higher risk because of the discrimination, the prejudice, the stigma, all of the ways that where there's mistreatment in our communities for folks in the LGBTQ+ community. And so we've talked about all these kind of risks and different kind of identity markers, things that are correlated to suicide risk, but we might be able to better understand what's going on and why someone might consider suicide if we look at these 4 pillars of suicide risk. And we're going to come back to these a few different times in our presentation because these 4 things can also be a way for us to work on prevention, right? And so we have hopelessness, right? How does a person think about the future? Do they feel any hope about the future? Social isolation. Who are this person's friends? Who can they count on? Do they feel a sense of belonging in the community? When we have folks considering suicide, there's often a lot of self-hatred, low self-esteem, really difficult challenges with confidence. And then lastly, this perceived inability to cope. So perhaps this is the first time this person has gone through something like this. And then it feels so much harder, more overwhelming because they have lack of stories of resilience to go by. It might feel insurmountable just because it's so new and there's not a pathway forward in some folks' minds. So these 4 pillars, super important. They also, I think, are going to give us some keys of how to help folks.
Okay, so let's talk about protective factors. These are things that ideally would counteract risk factors, and they're going to start pivot us towards the prevention part of suicide. So having coping skills is incredibly protective. People learn these in therapy, they learn them at school, they learn by watching others, but especially problem-solving skills. How do I get myself out of this situation? Having meaning and purpose, reasons for living, are very important. If you know why you're getting up out of bed and able to identify that, that's very important. Having good physical health, but especially exercising, regardless of the health that you're in, is very important. It does a lot of good things for our brains, gives us endorphins, is often social with others. So that's an important protective factor. And access to healthcare, that's very important. And especially referrals that are needed when someone might be heading towards crisis. Some of the social protective factors are family connection. Are you in touch with your family? Do they know if you are up for the day and going about your usual day? Religious involvement, and that's especially important to this community. And another thing to know about religious involvement is that it actually increases lifespan by an average of 4 years. That's what they're showing in longevity research. That's one of my side hobbies, longevity research. So we're both a protective factor and great for health, not just lifespan, but health span. Social support, which means especially schools for our young people, for teenagers. Do they have a counselor at that school? Is the school staffed well enough to accommodate teens there? And also having internet access. I put that as part of the teens because we think of that as, being something that they do more of. But, if you are living in a rural area and you find a group of people who like, classic cars and you're able to talk to them every day, then that's a really great network of support. So having internet access is protective. Being employed, even part-time, gives you back to that sense of meaning and purpose. And having social values. So if you can name things that are important to you about the world that you live in and things that you stand for. And I would also include things that you hold dear to your heart. This can even be something like cheering for a particular sports team, right? Like if you have that value of really just needing to stick around and see if the Giants can do a little better. Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the myths and misperceptions that are often widespread in our culture that we just really want to address. And the first one is that talking about suicide does not give someone the idea. And that's really important because when we start talking with folks that we're concerned about, we want to get in the practice of naming suicide directly, asking about it directly. It's not going to kind of encourage somebody or give them an idea. But if someone is thinking about suicide, it may be a relief. Finally, I can talk to somebody in the community about this. Oh, yes, so sorry. And a second one is that suicidal thoughts are not permanent. They're not a part of our identity. And this should be really encouraging, right? If someone is thinking about suicide, it doesn't mean that that's it and they're going to go forward the way they're going to go forward. In reality, we know there are a lot of interventions and treatments that do kind of change the course for folks. And not everybody that considers suicide then goes on to attempt suicide. And this goes into the next one, right? Someone may be having some suicidal thoughts, maybe occasionally thinking, oh, I wish I could disappear. And that does not necessarily mean that they're going to take action. And so later on, we're going to talk about how do we decipher who really needs kind of emergency support and who needs kind of more long-term support. And usually maybe a combination of both in some cases. The next one that we want to kind of bring up is that suicides probably every time are a surprise and feel like a real shock. And at the same time, there's often some clues or some indications. And if we know what to look for, we can help support folks. And so we want to kind of keep in mind that suicides rarely happen out of nowhere. And the next one that's really important to think about is that people do not reveal suicidal thoughts to get attention, right? Sometimes, and we'll talk about this a little later too, there's some language or some sort of subtext of blaming our folks that are considering suicide. And we really want to get away from that because really folks that are considering suicide are suffering. It's driven from suffering. And so when we think about this idea of they're just wanting to get attention, I would really invite us to reframe it to they're really wanting to get help. And then the next thing we want to emphasize, which is important to remember today when we're talking about suicide so much, this is a rare event, right? It's serious, it's devastating. We really want to give it a lot of attention, but it is rare. And so hopefully we can kind of keep that in mind when we're having this really heavy conversation. And
so about 14 out of every 100,000 people is the statistic right now.
Right. And so the last thing is that I've already kind of mentioned is that suicidal thoughts and behaviors come from suffering and they're not deliberate. This person is not trying to do this on purpose. It's not intentional. It's really just the suffering is driving the thoughts. The suffering is driving the actions. And that brings us into part 2.
We're going to talk about what to do now.
That's right.
So when we think about what to do, how to act, we've thought about some of the first layers of that, sandwich, the risk factors, what they mean to that particular person, whether they fall into any of those risk factors. And warning signs are different from risk factors. And so this is a sheet of very common warning signs, but it's important to emphasize warning signs are very person specific. So if you come to know that person and care about them, you will be the best person to say, this is a warning sign. And I want to highlight on the sheet, let's see, some of the things that we've talked about before. So some of the clear language, talking about wanting to die, having guilt or shame, picturing that Venn diagram, right? Like not belonging, feeling burdensome, but then especially changing behavior, making a plan or researching ways to die. We have to take this very seriously. Withdrawing, sometimes even giving away items that are important to them. And then taking dangerous risks such as driving extremely fast. There are other ways that people express themselves this way, but one of the reasons it's hard to get a lot of good statistics about suicide attempts is that when you speak to these folks after, they say, well, I knew what I was doing was dangerous, but I didn't really care what happened. And so it's hard to put them into a category, but that's where risky behavior comes from. And then these last three things are also indicative of major depressive disorder, mood swings, excessive sleep or less sleep, and using substances.
Louder, please.
Louder, yes. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to talk now about some do's and don'ts of talking about suicide. These are difficult conversations to have, but as you can see at the top of our don't list, the most important thing is to don't avoid talking about it. Really important to name it directly and show that you're a safe person, that you are able to receive and hear and listen and help someone through these moments. Similarly to this, we can sometimes, because of our worry or, this is a heavy topic, so we can sometimes use euphemisms to try to get the information, but sort of tiptoe around it a little bit. So perhaps asking somebody, should I be worried about you? Right? It's a lot implied there. If they answer yes, then what does that mean? So we really want to be kind of specific and direct as much as we can. And then going along with that, we really want to be mindful of the impact that our words have. And this can be really sneaky. Even within our kind of all of our language, it's really common to hear somebody say, we're talking about someone committing suicide, right? But when we think about how else we use the term, right? Committing a crime, committing adultery, right? So even just this little tiny phrase, it's so sneaky, it's kind of implying something really sort of a little bit of blame or a little bit of a charged way of talking about things. And so we might try instead to use the phrase, dying by suicide or considering suicide, attempting suicide, as a way to take some of the guilt or shame out of it. And so just again, thinking about our language, being mindful that somebody that's suffering this much already feels a lot of guilt and shame. And so we want to try not to contribute to that as much as we can. And then coming over to the do, we really want to provide a safe, private space to have these types of conversations, right? If we're really wanting to help somebody and then we kind of do like a big public intervention or like a call out, again, that's going to really contribute to some of that guilt or shame. And so figuring out a way to speak to somebody one-on-one if you're feeling concerned about them. And Lindsey's going to give us some specific language, exact questions to ask. But what we really want to do is name and ask about suicide directly. And this is hard. It's hard to say the word. It's hard to talk about. So we want to kind of be mindful that some of our own anxieties might come up when we're having the conversations. And we have to kind of remember that if we name it, it's not going to give anybody the idea. It's not going to be contribute in a harmful way. It's just us like having to really kind of power through, be brave, and be able to be with the potential reality of somebody's suffering. And going along with that, we're thinking about empathizing and normalizing. I can see you're really suffering. You must be feeling so hopeless right now. I really want to be here for you. Do you know what you might be needing right now? And so this is just an example of the last three there: normalizing, empathizing, staying calm, and using language carefully.
So one good example of using language carefully is how we phrase our questions. And it would be common to say something like, well, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? And instead, we want to ask these 2 questions. Have you ever thought about killing yourself? And do you have access to a firearm? I know that's intense, but it's something that you as our caring core here at this community really need to understand that those are the only 2 questions that you need to ask before you can take further steps. Okay, so we're going to move into what to do based on levels, what we consider levels of risk or levels of warning signs, actually. When someone is heading towards a crisis, understanding their personal warning signs and knowing their risk factors and what to do. And the first area we're going to focus on is urgent care.
Okay, so this is the heaviest part, right? When someone is really in crisis, they're in an emergency. And so just to kind of help us settle, we're safe right now, I'm gonna invite everybody to take a deep breath with me, okay? Okay. So when we're concerned about someone's safety, and especially if they say yes to the last 2 questions, right? I'm thinking about killing myself, right? Then we need to assess the level of emergency, right? Sometimes folks are having what we consider passive suicidal thoughts, right? When they're feeling really depressed, they think about acting on some kind of suicide plan, but they're not having really any intention of doing so. All right, and so the first 2 on this left-hand column where we see assess immediate safety, the first 2 bullet points here are really with the kind of goal of identifying how serious is this person in taking steps and actions toward a suicide plan, right? So we want to identify, is it sometimes I wish I could die, or is it I'm planning on, jumping into traffic? And so we really have to decipher the difference, because then it determines what level of emergency we're in. And some more questions we can ask around that are, do you have a plan? Have you ever thought about what you might do if you were going to act on thinking about your suicidal thoughts? And, perhaps they say, oh no, I never really thought of it, how I do it. I just think about it'd be nice to just not be here right now. But sometimes folks say, yeah, I've thought about how I would do it. And then it's really important to ask, okay, do you have access to the means to carry that out, right? So if the person says, I think about swallowing some of the pills that I have, then we want to know, okay, what pills do you have? How many pills do you have? Is there something we can do to help remove some of your access? Right? And so that's really an important piece, is do you have access to the means? It's like a much higher level of emergency if someone has access to lethal means. And then lastly, as Lindsey mentioned earlier, if someone has made previous attempts, then we know that they're at a heightened risk to take action again. And so that may sort of influence us to take more action of support, even if we don't hear I'm thinking about taking this action later today. We might, if someone's saying, I'm thinking about wanting to die, we might say, okay, let's get you some additional support because you had a previous attempt in the last 3 months, for example, right? So these kind of different pieces are super important, thinking about the person's intention to act, their plan, their access to means, and their previous attempts. And I have given you a handout with some, and I want you to just look at it briefly now. It looks like this. This gives us extremely specific questions that we can ask to check about the plan and the access to means and all these pieces, right?
It's known as the Columbia Protocol. And I just want to add that, we ask questions for a living. So we're used to asking difficult questions, but you would be surprised at how honest people are at answering questions. So just want to put that out there. They are big questions, but they answer our questions.
That's
even
right.
when we're not, being therapists. Okay.
Absolutely. And so on your sheet, it's just in different tones of gray. So it's helpful to see that these questions are sort of color-coded by the level of risk. And so especially if someone is answering yes to questions 3 through 6, we see that as more of an emergency situation, okay? And so if we get some of these yeses, yes, I have a plan, yes, I have access to means, then it's time to bring in a professional. And the fastest, easiest way to do that in an emergency, of course, is to call 911. Of course, that is can be a very intense sort of thing for the ambulance to come or for the police to come. So if you have a little more time, it may be a little easier of an event for the person going through this to bring them to the hospital, right? It's going to kind of lead to the same outcome, right? So instead of the cops coming or the ambulance coming, they will go to the hospital, and then a professional will do further assessment at the hospital. It's kind of per your judgment which one you choose when, but whatever you do in this type of situation, it's really important to stay with the person until there's a professional there to evaluate.
Isn't it 988 now for just suicide?
This is a great, so for an emergency, if you're concerned about their safety immediately, recommend calling 911 because that's gonna prompt like local emergency, the police, the ambulance, and so on. If it's where the person is thinking about suicide and maybe they don't need immediate emergency care, then we would call 988. And so that's, of course, useful in this situation. 988 can call 911 for you, but it's another kind of level of care. So if the person is really thinking about it, but we're not immediately concerned for their safety, calling 988 100% is the choice. And so this is kind of getting to the lower risk here. If somebody's thinking about suicide, maybe they have a plan, but they're not planning on doing it today, tomorrow. It's just they've thought about how they might do it. Then we're thinking more about a little bit of a lower risk, right? There's not an emergency today, but it's an ongoing risk. So we want to get some more additional supports. We want to call 988. We want to perhaps find some support people that can monitor and check in on the person. For example, if this person is living alone, perhaps they should go and stay with their aunt or a community member for a few days. And then lastly, really important for long-term recovery, so we can help folks kind of get out of these crisis or heading toward crisis situations, is to get some therapy, and particularly research-based therapy, which we're going to talk a little bit more soon. So
right now.
Oh yeah. So oops. So the Columbia Protocol is here. I would recommend practicing asking the questions, once or twice, so that if you were ever in an emergency situation, it wouldn't be the first time you've used the questions. And at the bottom, it kind of tells you what to do, right? If they answer yes, call 911. And so on. And so these are a really helpful tool to have on hand in the community. And that brings us to the action number 2.
Yeah. So the middle choice here, we kind of call this playing the long game. You have somebody who may have multiple risk factors, but they're not needing urgent care. And instead we are hoping that they will get a referral and try therapy. So what types of therapy is recommended for suicide? There's been multiple studies that show that these 2 types of therapy are recommended: cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy. They're quite mouthfuls, so we use their acronyms. They're related to each other. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been around for many decades, and DBT has been developed more recently and incorporates kind of a more wraparound approach. But they both try to identify and change problematic thinking. And at Loyal Blue, at our counseling practice, we are a CBT practice because it is considered best practices for depression, anxiety, insomnia, OCD, and suicide prevention. So when you can help somebody identify and change their thinking, they're less likely to identify suicide as a coping strategy, which is truly what it is, a very bad one, but that is how somebody is using it to cope. So CBT and DBT both help focus on practical coping strategies. We teach very practical skills, problem-solving skills. And DBT, because it's a little less known, I just wanted to mention its 4 modules are mindfulness, which is teaching people to pay attention to the moment. We tend to think as therapists of people who obsess about the past can tend towards depression. People who obsess about the future can tend towards anxiety. And people who can stay in the present tend to have the most life satisfaction. Interpersonal effectiveness. How does this person do with making friends, with having support, with asserting themselves at the workplace? DBT has a lot of interventions for interpersonal effectiveness. Distress tolerance. This is my personal favorite of the DBT modules. I define it as getting through the moment without making something worse. So you're not trying to learn a lot about yourself. You're not trying to improve a relationship. You're not trying to make big changes. You're just trying to stay the course and ride it out. That's distress tolerance. And emotional regulation, we think of as a tool that we learn through the ages. If we think about our youngest children who are dysregulated because they want to sit at the head of that table and it's round. I've actually had that happen with a child before and they can't figure out where to sit. We learn this as we grow up, how to take care of our emotions, calm ourselves down, grow ourselves up, and so on. So CBT and DBT both have great effectiveness at building problem-solving skills, experiencing events without considering suicide, because remember suicide is, at one end of a coping strategy. And those in therapy will hopefully learn these things, but they also are under the watch of a regular therapist, so they may escalate back to option one, and a therapist is able to monitor them and make sure that they don't need urgent care.
Okay, and the last area here, which I think is the most hopeful and the most exciting to share about in this group, is community support. And so we're thinking here about what can we all do together to help folks that are suffering and considering suicide. And we've provided some suggestions, and the first one is keep the environment safe. And that, of course, goes back to physical safety, making sure that folks don't have access to lethal means and sort of checking in about that. We want to really remove or prolong the time and distance between a person that's considering suicide and the lethal means, right? So thinking about ways we can help do that in the community, really valuable. And then the other 4 bullet points here are all going back to those 4 pillars of suicide we talked about before, right? So we're thinking about empathy and understanding, normalizing, helping folks build some sense of resilience. You're not alone. Normalizing mental health support. So perhaps you know somebody that had some therapy and it was really successful, or perhaps you've done some therapy and it was really successful. Being open to sharing about that casually can really help normalize mental health support in the community. I talked so much before about being mindful of the impact of our words, really remembering that folks that are considering suicide are suffering so deeply, and we really want to help them work through that. And the last one is learning more about our community members to identify community needs. And we want to think about kind of deep diving into the empathy for that, right? Somebody's more likely to share about their lives if they feel heard and understood. So we've provided some sentence frames here that can help somebody feel understood and can help the conversation get deeper and more real for a person, right? I hear you saying that it's been really difficult this past year. Is that right? This is just a simple paraphrasing of somebody's words. And it's so simple, but we find that just paraphrasing back what somebody has said often leads them to share a lot more about it. So using paraphrasing. And the second one is really identifying a feeling underneath of what's going on for the person. So they share something tough that's been happening. You might say, wow, that sounds so disappointing. That sounds so frustrating. I could imagine you're feeling really hurt right now, right? Just really empathizing and building understanding. And all of these are kind of in that heart. One more I'll just point out quickly is I really admire how you are handling the difficulties of this past year. I really admire, try to name a strength of a person that's going through something difficult, can really help activate some of that perceived inability to cope, right? It's a counter to that perceived inability, right? You've got so many things going, you've got so many strengths that can help you with this problem, right? And again, we want to get to know our communities better. So when empathizing isn't working, we might just ask some questions. And again, these are all connected to those 4 pillars. What do you see for yourself in the future is a question that helps us learn more about somebody's hope, right? Tell me about your friends. This is a question that's going to help us identify a sense of belonging or maybe some social isolation. How would you describe yourself to other people? This question is going to reveal, how somebody feels about themselves. Are they really suffering with some self-hate? And then lastly, have you ever experienced what you're going through now before? And that's going to really identify some of that perceived inability to cope, right? So really simple questions, casual, not about suicide or suffering at all, but they can reveal a lot about what's going on for somebody at a moment. And then we want to kind of leave these here for our next. We're going to invite you all to talk to each other. We've been talking a lot. So these are kind of going back through and identifying these key things that we can do in the community. We can keep environments safe, and that's physically, but also emotionally, like keeping our environments free of bullying and exclusion. Also, we can build hope. I mean, of course we can build hope in a religious environment, right? Promoting belonging for everyone, absolutely something we can do as a community. Inspiring self-love and confidence, I think that this one is something we can do through modeling, through our stories, all the things that we share together. And then lastly, normalizing struggle and providing some pathways, right? There are ways to get through this. Let's show you some stories of resilience. And so thinking about all these things, we're going to move into a little turn and talk. Lindsey, do you want to kind of?
Sure. We're near the end here and happy to take some Q&A if there's time. But what we thought we might do was have you talk to your table for, under 5 minutes. If you have any ideas based on what we've shared for your community here at LOPC, that might be useful, and things off the top of my head that are probably already implemented in some ways, but does anybody have a phone buddy, or how do we know when somebody hasn't come to service, or some of those types of things. But we'd love to give you a chance to just chat a little bit for 2 minutes. We'll have a sip of water, and then you're welcome to ask us any Q&A here on the recording or one-on-one afterwards. Sound good? Okay, thank you.
Okay, everyone, we're going to come back together, wrap up your last sentence here. Great. Thank you so much for engaging in this little mini conversation. I know that we really hope that, it's just the start of a conversation that you continue. And I also feel pretty confident that you all have had some of these conversations already. So we're really continuing a conversation, and it's really great to kind of be a part of the conversation with you this morning.
If anybody has any questions they want to ask while we are on the recording, or maybe there's anything from Zoom, we're happy to answer them. And then after that, we will close our part, and Jamie's going to come on up. So, yes.
I just had a little question about something that you mentioned early on. You used the figure 14 of 100,000 people.
14, that's the statistic of how many people die by suicide. Yeah. Notice how I could change my language there too. Yes. Mm-hmm. So adjusted for age, across all ages, 14. Yes. Yeah, 14. And it is slightly on the rise now following a dip in the pandemic. Yes.
So one of the reasons I asked them to talk about prevention first is, as Stephen ministers and as clergy, we know that obviously anyone in their immediate family or close family who's had a suicide is now more at risk for suicide.
Right.
Could you say anything more about that? That's why I like these refreshers. I think they're important.
Yes. So one of the things that can be important to remember with that is that, if you know someone who died by suicide, it can kind of add to this feeling that it's not so rare, right? Like we talked about before, right? It kind of, now you know someone that's, you know, that's done that, and now it feels like more of an option for you as well, right? Especially close family members, folks that were role models or connected to us in some way. It's kind of difficult to grapple with, and then kind of can contribute to suicidal thoughts for other folks in the family as well.
Kind of takes it off of a you know, untouchable place and makes it seem like a coping strategy that someone you know very well actually was able to use. And most of the time when we think about that type of death, it's very scary. Mm-hmm. So it almost kind of makes it more accessible and in the mind of someone who is considering that. Mm-hmm.
Well, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started on our second part. I did want to point out just a few things. These are LOPC related, but we actually got the ideas from last year's Soul Shop, which was talking about suicide prevention. The deacons at LOPC, we now have a community support resource, and it's actually based on all the pillars that they were just talking about, some of the reasons people have despair, consider suicide. So you're going to see on this one-page sheet, this is something we also provide to the community. But deacons also have these, so as they go on visits or they're at hospitals, they can also be mindful of what people need as far as this happens. And then the other one you're going to see, and this is resources that we pass out at the church for GLBTQI plus resources and support. And I want to let you know that these were put together with one of our youth who grew up here, who's now doing research and policy for transgender youth in particular. And she and a team of people helped me put these resources together that are local. And so you can find those, you know, if you ever need them, I will email this out afterwards. But if you have more to add, please do let me know. This is a way to take care of our youth and our families, and also to let people know we're here to support all communities at our church. So wanted to let you know about that. I hope the first section was helpful, even though I read about suicide and suicide prevention on a very regular basis. There's always changing things. And I think the thing that has probably sticks with me most is I'm sure most of us in this room have had an experience of losing someone to suicide. I know when I was in my teen years, my dad lost 4 friends to suicide, all fit very neatly within that 45 to 75-year-old white men category. So it's something that's been really important to me as a pastor to be mindful of. My dad's best friend 10 years ago died from suicide, and his daughter is also one of my best friends. So we've really walked through a lot, both with friends, but also, and I was given permission to share this, but also with my niece who's had 2 suicide attempts. So we've really lived this. So what I'm sharing today is some of our shared lived experience as a family to both people who are friends, but also most recently for the past, 10 years now, with my niece, who is actually really thriving and doing well, and has really, a lot of the things Emmy was talking about today, and Lindsey, a lot of those resources really saved her life, but especially having a community that was supportive and that she could reach out to, be it family, friends. She goes to a church that's very supportive of all people as well and spends a lot of time on mental health. So I know the benefit of what it means to be a church, a community that is supporting people post-vention, after suicides, or even I would argue after suicide attempts. If you're, fortunate enough that, that my niece survived, there's images that you have a hard time, working through. So those are some of the pieces we're going to talk about today for our last part. And the other piece too that I love from the first section was looking at the religious community. I am going to talk about some stigma. I think that's really important after a suicide. That is really typical, unfortunately, in too many religious communities. But I'm also reminded the positive side, which Emmy and Lindsey lifted up. And actually, you can see this on veterans' websites too. So the U.S. government actually suggests for veterans who are struggling with suicide or suicide ideation, actually religious communities are listed as a community support for our veterans. And so I think it's powerful that more and more people are seeing that if you're part of what I would call, no one's perfect, no church is perfect, but if you're a church that is open and authentic and willing to have the hard conversations, that people can really thrive in those places, and also be open to be a church that can get feedback. Where are we falling short? For me, one of the places I realized we're falling short was through our Soul Shop training last year. So now if you go in our bathrooms, you will see some of the resources that they provided earlier in our bathrooms, because my first question was, how do we help the men then? But if that's actually our biggest for this church, the biggest place, how do we start helping those 45 to 75-year-old men? And I think there's a lot of answers to that, but kind of the easiest first one was right after that, we laminated cards that give you information in every bathroom on campus of who to contact if you're thinking about suicide. So we have a monthly check, actually, because we've noticed a few people have taken them, which is great. I'm glad they have them. But at the first of every month, our custodial team goes in and checks to make sure that we still have them in all the bathrooms. And it has domestic violence and victims as well. So talking about after suicide, as Emmy and Lindsey reminded you and remind us too, because I actually had some tears while I was putting this together, just to care for ourselves after. It's heavy, hard things, especially talking about after suicide. But as care ministers and Stephen ministers, people who are I see some more deacons in the room, and parents, and we're here to care for other people. But that also means we need to prioritize our self-care as well. So if you're having a hard time today after this, I just encourage you, reach out to your support people, reach out to me, reach out to other pastors. If you just need to sit and talk afterwards, by all means, please, let's make sure and connect with one another and not do these things alone. So postvention, this refers to the actions taken by to support individuals, families, and the community after somebody dies by suicide. And research shows, and I will give you all my references at the end, Columbia, Cornell are really fantastic universities that spend a lot of time looking at end-of-life care, as well as suicide prevention and postvention. So those are several great resources. But Stephen ministers, and deacons and other people who are part of this church, we can all be part of that postvention. And for 10 years now, I've been watching this community. When I first started, my first week here, actually, we lost one of our youth to suicide. And so I've been watching for 10 years how this community has supported that family. And I mean, I could list off almost, 100 plus ways. But one of the things that they shared publicly and in a letter sent to many of us was just, it takes a community to bury a child, especially from suicide. And that's always stayed with me. There's different kinds of grief. I know that if anyone's an expert, it's probably this group of people at the church. So I want to focus not so much on grief. The idea of grief is that most people after a loss, save for suicide or losing a child, most people within about 6 to 9 months, and this is evidence-based research coming out of Cornell. Let me know if you'd like that book. They have many books on it, but that's one that I like in particular, that most people are getting back to a somewhat normal life, meaning they don't have to remind themselves to breathe. They don't have to remind themselves to get out of bed, or if they do, it's a little bit easier. It doesn't feel so raw and painful. And just, I don't even know how I'm going to, get through one thing today. So that's considered grief, right? That, again, most people are beginning to see an upswing. It does not mean they don't have, of course, hard days, as we know, on birthdays or celebrations or first Hanukkah without your loved one, or Christmas or New Year's or whatever it may be. But complicated grief is a really different thing. And this is, again, majority of people, they estimate about 80% of people who've lost someone from suicide close to them, a friend, someone in your nuclear family, a grandchild, that most people experience complicated grief, which means this is lasting well past 6 months. And I think that's a really important thing to know, that, not that we want to ever go, oh, great, it's been 6 months, we're going to move on. We don't ever want to do that, of course, as pastors or Stephen ministers, but to know that the kind of grief they're experiencing probably needs a lot more prongs of support is how I would put it. And that's because in complicated grief, there is an actual diagnosis that a psychologist or psychiatrist can give for this. And the reason that matters on how people are diagnosed is because that also often means our healthcare will pay for certain treatment that they may not, or if you have complicated grief, they might support that treatment for much longer for a care receiver than they would if you weren't diagnosed with complicated grief. So that's my hospital administrator hat that I'm putting on from my past, that's actually really important for people to have a diagnosis. It often matters for the kind of resources and care that they'll get. They touched on quite a few things earlier today, but the thing about complicated grief, especially because of suicide, is that there are, for the people remaining, I've yet to meet a family who doesn't feel shame or stigma or secrecy. And let me just start with shame. Some of that is coming from religious institutions. And if you look generationally, if you asked our young people today at LOPC, did your friend who died from suicide, we had a suicide within our church community last year, one of our beloved young women, no one would tell you there's any shame around that this is a person who is struggling. Of course, the church loves her. They won't even think to even, I don't think, ask that question about, does the church still love this person? But if you go back 50, 60, 70 years, in some places around the world, some places in the United States for churches, they would say this is a sin, right? You have committed a sin. It used to be, it's changed, I'm glad, in the Catholic and Orthodox churches, but it used to be that they could not be buried at the church. They couldn't be buried at a religious cemetery. And so just keep in mind when you're working with people that think about the generations and how they might see, right? Like not even growing up in a church, this has been the church I've now been part of for longest. So when I think of mental health and I think of suicide, of course I think that, of course we're going to take care of families here. Of course I hope there's no shame or stigma. But the other piece is a lot of people are not educated about suicide. And I have found this, whether it's suicide or after a rape, that people don't want it to happen to them. And so there's this tendency to get very protective of this could not ever happen to me. So I'm going to kind of blame the victim for this. That's really typical in some crimes, but also something we'd say is not a crime, which is suicide, but that there is blaming from society. The other piece is probably the most helpful thing I've ever seen is 3 years ago, we had a family that's part of this church lose a grandparent to suicide. And, I got the call right away, went over. This is a family that has children and lots of grandchildren in the family. And the first thing they said is, we want to be totally open about this. We just need your help on how to do this. And I could see all of you being in that role too. And so we sat down and let's talk about where are the places that people need to know about this, right? They have 6 kids. Coaches, church, schools, friends, 6 children. You can imagine there is 18 years apart from these kids. So that's a very large age span. You need to talk to kids differently at every part. We're not, one of the commitments they had as a family is we are not going to hide this. We are going to share why grandpa died. We're going to share, why we think it happened, even though we're really confused about that, but we're not going to not ask the questions. And we're going to share it with our community. And some people may be angry at us for having to discuss this with our kids, but we're not going to make our kids feel ashamed. And it is a letter I've held on to. I helped craft this letter per their request with them, and I could see that being really useful for Stephen ministers. And we spent 6 hours just talking through, over a 2-day period, the details. How do we let's just take the school. Who are the people in the school that need to know? Who are the counselors? And they sent out a letter to everybody. And, I asked after it's sent, they said, we're kind of scared to listen to people's comments. or what kind of feedback we were going to get. They were like, of course, people did kind of invade a little bit of the privacy. Well, how did he do it exactly? Or how did this happen? Right? So that's some of the reasons people might want to keep it secret. Most of us probably won't want to share the details of our loved ones passing. I think in cancer, it's much more typical that you share actually what happened. There's often a time that you get to be together. I know when my grandma passed, my grandpa was with her. She died of cancer. We were there the week before, right? There's usually a process that happens. With suicide, it's so different. But, what ended up happening is you had a family that didn't have to deal with secrets. It was, we're going to talk about this. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end how to support children through this specifically. But that they made a family decision of, we're not going to feel guilty. Well, they had to deal with some of that, but we're going to try not to. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, we don't want our kids to feel shamed. We don't want to feel shamed. We don't want the remaining spouse to feel ashamed of this. So it's really, really difficult and tricky. But again, this often results in isolation. So we talk about too why people who've had a loved one die from suicide might be more likely. Another reason is after a suicide, feeling very isolated. Either they feel like they want to protect that sister, brother, spouse, grandparent, loved one who died from suicide, and they don't want people asking questions. And so, or they don't think it'll be accepted, or they'll be blamed. So there's a lot of secrecy. And that leads to lack of support and isolation. So as Stephen ministers, obviously that's something you'll want to pay attention to when you're working with people who've lost a loved one from suicide. And then also for all of us who are in this, in care, understanding why this grief is different and how it's different can be is really important for us. So I've already mentioned a few things. Obviously, most suicides, again, I've yet to meet a family. They might be able to tell you the reasons later on down the line, but there's shock, right? Even if they knew that their child was changing medications or had depression, but a lot of people actually are never diagnosed with depression who die from suicide. Sometimes it's really shocking, or I'd say it's always shocking. And also, there's not a clear understanding of why suicide happened. They talked earlier about it's a sandwich, right? There's many different layers to it, versus if you die of cancer, usually there's a very clear reason why you died, and people are going to give you sympathy and be empathetic, and there's not questioning. You might have questions about why did God let this happen, or why did this happen to a person, those are different kinds of questions, but there's very rarely you're not going to understand why, right? They had cancer, they passed away, or they had a chronic illness. Again, stories sometimes lack commonality. When I've worked with cancer survivor groups, people who've lost loved ones to cancer, there's some similar and shared stories. And I think I've found among survivors of suicide, there are some shared stories too. But the complicated pieces are so many that sometimes it takes a little more work in the support groups to get to a point where you're finding some commonalities. So that can be really difficult. Again, the circumstances of a loss, if you lose someone to suicide, even in our county, the police are going to come. There's an investigation usually. Some suicides happen at home, but I know my daughters, one of their students from their school, the dad did jumped off a building. It was very public, right? So there's different ways that people, have to deal with that. And there's a lot of complications to that. If it was very public for people, or also, if someone found their loved one at home, that's incredibly difficult. We're going to talk a little bit more about religious stigma. I think they covered the language matters really well. In many places, I don't know of the US, I should check on this, but I know in Great Britain, in 1961, they finally said suicide is not a crime. So when people talk about committing suicide, just think generationally too, it was a crime in the United States for a long time as well. I think that changed maybe in the 50s, but most countries, there are many countries it's still a crime, right? So think about that. Probably that's not going to probably be our experience perhaps here, but as more people, when I lived in Houston, people live from all around the world. And we did find at our church when people lost loved ones to suicide, they had to deal with that issue of it was considered criminal in their country. And that's a whole nother layer of work you need to do with people. This is a really important thing, I think, for Stephen ministers and for pastors, is just to know, depending on what the situation was like. Maybe you didn't see the event happen, but maybe you were there and you found your loved one, is that often what's recommended now is that they actually go through trauma care first, right? So family members aren't jumping right into, you can go into therapy, but they're also recommending a period of time for family members for trauma therapy. And that's very different. And there's very few people who are trained in trauma. You'll see on our therapist list at LOPC, I have some notes on people who actually have trauma-related therapy experience. Lindsey and Emmy both have it, but there's actual, certifications now that you can get through University of Washington, Columbia, Cornell, a lot of the social work schools nationally. That therapist, it's an extra layer, because I know when I did my Master of Social Work degree, it was a clinical degree. We did not spend much time on suicide. And that was granted 20 years ago. I know they spend a lot more time and have a whole center on it now. So that's, glad to see that. But just know that if they're asking you for recommendations for therapy, that again, someone with experience in trauma is really critical when they're finding a therapist, because a lot of other therapists might miss that piece before they can get into the more kind of uncomplicated grief, shall we say, maybe a poor way of putting it. So they spoke a little bit about the cognitive behavioral therapy, but that is the most widely accepted therapy by evidence-based researchers on what is most helpful to people, both for prevention, but also working with people after they've experienced the suicide of a loved one, because they may need to work on some ways they think about things and shifting. So a lot of our young people, that's why they go to Loyal Blue. There's not a lot of counselors in this area who do that particular training in Lafayette. So that's been really important just for referring people. I already mentioned counselors, therapists with suicide-specific grief training. That's really important. And then also survivors of suicide loss group. There are, if you go to the American Society for Suicide Prevention, there's a number of websites, I have them at the end, that you can go to and actually find groups for people. But I highly recommend people, if you've lost someone to suicide, to at least initially, and usually after about recommended for grief groups is usually 6 months or later after a loss. Some people might need it sooner, but again, for people who had a suicide in their family, usually the shock lasts much longer than it does for many other people. So I'm going to tell you about, we'll see if we have a little time, but if not, I'm going to send these out to you. There's some really good, there's about a 45-minute video that is on AFSP, which is the suicide prevention website I was just talking about. There's, I think for this group in particular, there's a 3-minute segment, which I think we're going to end on, that talks about how they found hope and how they've gotten through it. So you can watch the full 45-minute documentary. But what I like about it is it has, people who've lost a brother, sister, friend, son, daughter. It has them talking more about, several people of color. One woman is specifically talking about how her church, and she kind of grouped them all together, but I've only worked in probably 20 African-American churches on the south side of Chicago, but and 20 years ago, but that wasn't something that was widely talked about or looked upon. So I know there are a consortium of Black churches in the United States who are doing a lot of work together to begin just broaching this topic at their churches. They know it's a need. I think it's a need probably for all churches, but given the statistics for people of color, that's really been heightened. And you'll actually see on one of the organizations that I passed in your handout, there are 4 Christian-based organizations for those of you who have care receivers who are Christians. And one of the resources I think is fantastic is called Many Voices, and it's a Black church for gay and transgender justice. They have a lot of great resources on suicide prevention and how to talk about it more in churches too. So I think probably when I think of Stephen ministry, I think about, or if you're a deacon or the kind of lay work that you're doing in the church, is that you have a really special place that you get to be both someone who has expertise, but also I would say how it's been related back to me as a pastor, as Stephen ministers also become friends. I know there are, of course, professional boundaries and things like this, but you have a very special relationship and trust that's built in a way that other people may not have, including pastors. If someone's fairly new to the church, but has had a long-term, Stephen minister, they're probably going to have a closer relationship with all of you than they do with the pastors who, can't spend that amount of time. And so I think just came up with a few things that are faith-based for those, but it could also be not faith-based. If you have care receivers who that's not part of your relationship, I think you can still do these things. So Catherine Shearer is a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. I have her information at the end of this PowerPoint, and I'll make sure you get it. But I loved how she said it. She said, mourning is a process by which bereaved people seek and find ways to turn the light on in the world again. And I love that sentiment. I think it speaks to us of, for us who are seeing it from a faith perspective, it's that hope they talked about a little bit earlier, right? The encouragement, the faith, believing that it can get better and that there's other people's stories, which is what I like about the video clip I'm going to show you, is other people's stories can help you on your journey and to make it through. And for those of us who've never had a direct experience, if we're a caregiver, with suicide, it can be hard to understand if you haven't been through it. So just a few tips from me to you is, let the care receiver explore their questions and give space to their what ifs. In therapy, sometimes they'll have time on this. A lot of people just need to talk about what could I have done differently in order to move past this idea that maybe there's nothing they could change. I had a family I worked with that for, I feel like 1 year, that's when we were together once a month, that's really all we talked about is they just needed space. I'd say, do you want to talk about the what ifs today? Or, get rid of some of that guilt because they had so much guilt about if I'd only done this or if I'd come home 2 minutes earlier or the story you can imagine we would all have of, oh my gosh, if I just called them at this exact time, it wouldn't have happened. Just to need, to create a safe space to just, we're not going to judge you, right? And the fuller video that I'm going to suggest you watch when you have some free time, the dad actually shares that he and his son got in a physical fight the night before, and then his son died. And he just shared that he said, I grieve both the fact that, his son came at him, and although he didn't physically hurt his son was very angry. And he said just needing to talk about that and have space. I know obviously everyone should be in therapy as well as having a Stephen minister after a suicide. But I think there's things that you can do that you don't have time for in therapy, and this might be one of them. They need to spend a little bit more time being able to come to peace with the questions they have. I shared a little bit about crafting, how they will share their story of loss. It may come in phases. It might be that you sit down and just help them write out, just for this next month, they've, for someone who's passed, this is the story we're going to use for right now. And maybe other family members they don't want to, or they're not capable. I'm very close with my sister, and my sister, at the beginning when my parents said, we're going to make you executors for our will, my sister started crying, and she's like, I can't do that. I don't want any part of it. I trust Jaime, just make her the executor. I can't even have these conversations. And so you get to know kind of your place in the family. There's people who, I don't know why I can do that. I'll be a mess on the day my parents pass, but I can just, I don't know, move in a different way than my sister can. And she has other things she can do, like real estate development that I can't, know nothing about, and she'll take that piece on. But helping them craft a story, like maybe this is what you could say to people when they ask, in a way that protects their privacy, but also shares what happened. You might have other families who say, nope, we're going to be totally open about this. It's all we can do. And you might have some in between. My best friend and the loss of a parent from suicide, I've watched the history over the past number of years since it happened, and just seeing more openness along the way as she works through what she has needed to. So everyone, helping them figure out what their boundaries are. What are your boundaries that you need to share the story? And they might change over time. They might expand, or they might hit a point where they're like, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Like, I feel at peace, and I don't feel like it matters that they need to know it was a suicide. For others, it might be really important because they want to, share their story and work in a way, that might be part of their healing, to be out there and do advocacy in a different way, but that's not for everyone. Sometimes, and this gets back to the religious piece, supporting the family or the care receiver you work with on a memorial service. I've had families, I think I've done 6 services now after suicides, and a lot of them feel like they don't deserve to have a celebration, or they really struggle with, I don't know if we can deal with this. And so helping them figure out, like, well, maybe a year from now would be better for you, or maybe in a few months, or there's no rush. Some people just want to get it done and over with, and I respect that too. I've had families who are like, as soon as possible, especially around traumatic, what we would call more traumatic deaths, like, no, we just want to make it through this, and then we can move on to our healing. So I think helping them figure out, but the celebration piece, I think, is very important. That they don't have to make the whole service about the suicide, right? As Lindsey shared well earlier, it's not who they are, it's a part of their story. So helping them really focus on, okay, let's talk about this person. What did you love about them? What were their gifts? Help them see that, this is a part of their story, but it's not the whole story. I think that's whether you're a religious person or not, might be a memorial service that's out at a park. It may not be at a church, but help them figure that out. And then, as he would for anyone who's grieving, but I found over the years that when someone passes from suicide, people might feel more reluctant to reach out to people on their birthdays or the day they passed or for other things. And so, I have a list of people that I reach out to and have been for a long time every month that I just send a text. I've got their kid's birthday or spouse's birthday on my calendar, and I just reach out and say, just thinking of you today. Real simple, nothing big. But usually the feedback is, I needed that today, or that arrived just at the right time. So just those little pieces. And because you have special relationships with the people you're working with, I know there's an end. I don't know, this is actually my question. Can you keep in touch with people after, right? You still keep in touch and have those relationships. So even though you may not be their Stephen minister actively, right, to keep reaching out. And I've noticed too that especially our families who've lost people to suicide, I still reach out to them monthly. And I might just pick a different day every month, just thinking of you. I don't write anything specific, just so they know I'm still here. And I know this group's really good at it. So support for children and grandchildren of your care receivers. Unfortunately, probably with social media and with, everything being, I think, out there more, kids are going to hear about suicide more. So maybe it's not in their family, but probably if you have a care receiver that's lost a loved one to suicide, there is going to be a child somehow involved. And this is usually the least amount of training people have, is supporting those families after a suicide or any kind of loss. Discuss a loss in age-appropriate ways. If you have questions, call a therapist. There are a lot of really good resources out there. University of Washington is one, which I have at the end of the slide. They actually have a center they will send you books. I just gave my last one out, but I will order some more on how to help children creatively express their loss and their grief. after a suicide or after a death. But again, age-appropriate ways. So how I'm going to talk to a 3-year-old is really different than how I'm going to talk to, an older child. Like my daughter was here sitting this morning. I would not have had her here sitting if we hadn't already talked about the subject at length. And she's already had the experience of 2, one luckily did not work. The attempts did not work, but she is old enough, she's 13, that this is kind of part of everyday life for our teenagers. They talk about these things. There was a death a few weeks ago at De La Salle, and they did a memorial the day after this young man passed. And of course, they didn't say why. So all the kids were like, well, it's suicide. That's how everyone dies our age. It ended up being a car accident. But I bring that up because that's usually what our kids go to. This is a normal experience. And so even though it's 14 in 100,000, which is smaller than most of the deaths, everyone's had an experience, and our young people and our teenagers, this is normal for them, right? They hear about this. It might be on TikTok or something else. During the pandemic, there was actually a completed suicide that was on one of the websites. We actually got an email home saying, parents, please know that it was on, I don't want to say the wrong website, so I'm not going to say it, but it was one of the very, typical websites that kids go to where someone took their life, and the estimation was that almost 1 million kids watched that before they were able to take it down. So it's part of the kids' experience. Tell the truth. Children and youth know when you're not telling the truth. I'm like, they're very good at this as someone who's worked with kids for a long time. Tell the truth of what happened age appropriately. They're going to find out somehow anyway. I do want to put one caveat on that. If kids are 2 and 3, probably not going to have the conversation about how they died. You might say it's tragic, we weren't expecting it, those types of things. But definitely pick a date or a time, and usually it's when they're developmentally ready, that you're like, we're not like, this is on our calendar. We're going to sit down and talk with our kids about this at this age. So that they, again, know that if you ever feel this way too, it's nothing to be ashamed of. We're here. There's no guilt. There's no stigma. Expect different emotions and reactions like we would have. We all grieve differently. We know as adults. You might be married, but you grieve probably very differently. And be prepared for fears. It's really scary. The first time I discussed suicide with one of my kids, because of our niece, she didn't sleep for 2 nights. I mean, she had all these questions, which I've heard from a lot of kids. Well, what if I accidentally do that? Or it's a scary, scary thing for kids. But as you start normalizing it, not in the sense of it being, the coping mechanism we want you to have, but normalizing your talk with them, that I actually ask my kids on a pretty regular basis, like, are you thinking about suicide? My kids kind of roll their eyes, but it started because one of my kids I felt needed that. And it became this thing of like, as a parent, I just want to do everything I can to make sure that, I can't control everything, but, having those conversations. And I've had those with our teens here at the church. And some have needed help right away. And I'm thankful that some of the time we can hopefully help. We have some power there. I've already talked about enough, probably talk about suicide openly. And just like we would with any kind of loss, remember and talk about the person often. I think that's really important. I spoke a little bit already about informing the child's school and counselors. If people decide, we're not going to tell people it was suicide for whatever reason, but to make sure that the people in their life know that there was a loss, that this is going to impact our child. It will. Today, tomorrow, for life. Something that's really different with children and teens is the question I get for any loss from parents is, okay, we had a few years ago, they have 2 sets of twins and all 4 acted totally different in losing a grandparent. And they were like, which one's right? I was like, well, they're all right? They just, they all are having a different reaction to, grandpa dying. But kids tend to do really good, and I wish that adults would do this more, so maybe this can be our takeaway today, is to provide outlets for kids and teenagers for grieving. It might be walking, it might be shopping, it might be swimming or music or walks or doing something to get them out and about. But usually how I coach parents is if you can get them doing an activity, they're probably going to talk with you more, right? I find primo time in my car, like some of the most fabulous conversations I've had is either I force my oldest kid to walk with me once a week at the reservoir, and that becomes our talking time. And we talk, I mean, the stuff we talk about, wow, it's kind of amazing. She's 14. But that's a forced activity. But I tell parents, you're the parent or you're the grandparent. You can make them do something with you like that, and make it a time where they're talking. I mean, most of the time we want to, most of the time I value when my 14-year-old says, Mom, I don't want to do that. But I'm like, this is forced family bonding time. That's like, but I have a purpose for it. And it's usually now she actually enjoys it. So that's a good thing. But again, providing outlets for our people. So we have talked about a lot today. I'm going to go ahead and just send you the clips, but I encourage you to watch them. I think they're really hopeful and meaningful for all of us, to just be reminded that, this is probably one of the most awful things that can happen in life, but there's also hope after it. And many of us have walked through and survived these kinds of things after suicide. One of the clips actually has a mom talking who lost her teenage daughter. And she, of course, talks about the hard healing process. And she said, but I also became a new kind of person after this. Like I had to make a choice if I was going to stay in this forever. And she said, of course, I miss my daughter every day. She said, but I've also become a better, more loving person out of this because I've kind of had to. She said, but I also chose to. And she talked about a lot of the support we talked about today. And that's from the American Society for Suicide Prevention. So I have these two clips for you, and I'll send it in the PowerPoint so you can watch. I did want to just bring a few resources to your attention. In the forefront of suicide at University of Washington, they have incredible resources for every age group. Columbia Psychiatry, Dr. Catherine Shearer that I had mentioned, they actually have an entire center for prolonged grief, and their resources are fantastic. Cornell, theirs is called the Center for Research on End-of-Life Care. So they have a lot on grief in general. So for Stephen Ministers, I hope it's helpful. And then a few others, the American Society for Suicide Prevention. I think they have some of the best videos that you can watch. And it's called Journeys of Hope and Journeys for Families. So that link will take you right to that spot. A few other resources. The last one I wanted to point out, just the top one, National Institutes of Health. They actually have a lot of qualitative research that people share their stories coming from every perspective of loss. Might have been your aunt, your uncle, your friend, a spouse, but they have a lot of research on how to work with people coming from different perspectives. So that is all. We are at, oh, sorry, I realized, I always forget, that says 1:30 back there. I was watching, we're at 1:34. I did want to see if anyone had any last questions. I'll be here if anyone has anything they need, but I would, obviously, I know you have your peer groups that you can go and talk with one another. It's been a lot of information today. We will make sure everyone gets all of it. And I hope that it was somewhat beneficial today. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you.
You're welcome. Go in peace.